Hello, Starshine. My name is Liz, and this is my channel, Simsational Stories. If you have not seen my videos before and you enjoy this one, please like and subscribe. And maybe check out my Facebook page, where this whole thing began as well. Just be aware that I may be way further ahead there than I am here on my channel, so only look it up if you're alright with spoilers. All relevant links are in the description below, and of course if you're a Sims player and you'd like to download any of the characters featured in my stories, just search the hashtag Simsational Stories on the Sims 4 gallery. All original content is created by This Is Not Eric. Alrighty then, so welcome, and what is up, Buttercup? Are you having a good day or a bad day? Whichever your answer, please allow me to distract you from your life and tell you a story. A Simsational story. Before I begin though, I would like to issue this blanket content and trigger warning. The following story is entirely fictional, comically dramatic, and probably rather ridiculous. All my stories are. The characters are quite often caricatures, the subject matter taboo and or toxic, and the turn of phrase frankly rather falutin at times. I want to assure you now that, although I mean absolutely no harm, I completely understand if you feel unable to consume my content. Many loves, and we will catch each other on the internet elsewhere. Okay, so now we've gotten that over with, let's go. Today's story is from Magnus Down and the StrangerVille mystery, and we're at chapter 1. The introduction reads, always a bit of a nerd, it was almost inevitable that Magnus would grow up to be a scientist. But what wasn't inevitable was what happened next. Magnus Down grew up experimenting. He was always a bit of a loner and kept his projects to himself, but by the time he finished high school, he'd already gotten the attention of a local research laboratory who offered him a job straight after graduation. At first, Magnus lived alone, spending his evenings after work playing video games. The laboratory had helped him find a small 2-bedroom house, which to Magnus's delight had a basement lab. And given that he intended to work there for the foreseeable future, Magnus used his life savings to put a deposit down. If things went the way he hoped at work, it wouldn't be long before he could afford to pay it off anyway. And work was going well. Magnus had quickly become a respected and valued member of the team. The work they were doing was top secret, but that made the whole thing that much more exciting, and Magnus often caught himself staying late. Of course, it wasn't just work that was attracting his attention. Her name was Ashley Bermudez, and she was all Magnus could think about. It took him weeks to finally work up the courage to ask her out, and he couldn't believe it when she said yes. On that first date, she told him all about her family, mother, father, and brother, back home in Willow Creek, and he told her all about his distant, long-since divorced parents, whom he never even heard from anymore. They laughed about work and compared gaming abilities. Ashley and Magnus were soon the subject of office gossip. It was pretty obvious what was going on. They were even caught sneaking up to the observatory one time. And so after 3 weeks of being the world's worst kept secret, they came out on social media. 3 months later, and Ashley had moved into Magnus's place. She'd been spending so much time there, it hadn't made sense to keep her stuff at home anymore. And they were so happy together. Neither of them had ever been in a real relationship before, so there had been some hiccups at first. Magnus was a lot tidier than she was, and Ashley, for her part, couldn't stand how he refused to play video games with headphones when she was trying to read. But they were working it out and learning to compromise. Things were changed forever the night Magnus got abducted. He had always had questions about the universe, and if he couldn't sleep, would often go out back and look up at the stars through his observatory. But he'd never dreamed anything like this could or would ever happen to him. How could aliens be real? That was what he'd always thought. Until now, anyway. At first, Magnus wasn't sure if he really had been abducted, or if he'd imagined the whole thing. He knew he couldn't tell Ashley about it because they'd already had that talk, and she didn't believe in aliens at all. What would she say if he tried to tell her he woke up in the middle of the night to strange lights outside, went to go look, and was abducted by them? And so, Magnus tried to put the incident behind him, but he was plagued by mysterious symptoms that were beginning to worry him. He'd gone off his food first, and then when he did eat, it was always something weird. Whoever heard of gummy bear pancakes anyway? That he felt a crazy craving for. What was going on? Now, first and foremost, Magnus was a scientist. So after a couple of weeks of pretending that none of this was going on, he finally steeled himself to start doing some tests. Nothing on earth could have prepared him for this, because nothing on earth could have done this. It simply wasn't possible. It wasn't meant to be. And yet, Magnus couldn't deny it. He'd run the test 16 times, and it kept coming back positive. He was pregnant! He had to talk to Ashley now. She was going to notice this. And what was she going to do? How was she going to feel? Magnus didn't know how he felt himself yet. It was also unthinkable, fantastic, and new. Magnus was, at his estimate, about 5 months pregnant when he finally told his girlfriend about it. Ashley hadn't believed Magnus at first, but after going downstairs and running some tests on him herself, she also couldn't deny it. She didn't know how he was pregnant, let alone how he was expected to give birth, but there was definitely a baby something in there. Ashley had never believed in aliens before, and she still wasn't entirely sure what had happened, but the whole thing grossed her out. Magnus, on the other hand, was in a different place about everything. Ashley was kind of horrified when he took her out on Love Day and proposed to her in public. They hadn't even been together a whole year, not to mention this whole thing where he was pregnant. What was he thinking? They weren't ready for this. She wasn't ready for this. Despite her misgivings, Ashley said yes to Magnus's proposal. She just couldn't bear the thought of refusing him in front of all those people. And she did love him. Oh, so much. Magnus was the only man she'd ever been with, and she loved him with all of her heart. It was just this whole alien baby thing that had her freaked out. But she could push past it. She knew she could. Magnus was worth it. And Magnus was building a rocket ship now too, which he hoped he could use to find the baby's mother? Father. Whatever. He hoped to find his child's genetic other half. It was a lot of work, especially while pregnant. But Magnus was determined and worked every spare minute he had on the project. Ashley hoped they could use it to send the baby back with. Ashley grew more and more secretly uncomfortable with everything the more and more pregnant and obsessed with aliens Magnus became. He'd built a satellite now and was turning it on every night before going into the backyard to stare up at the sky. The original plan, her idea, had been to take the baby back to its planet, but Magnus seemed to have forgotten that as his rocket grew nearer and nearer to completion. Instead, Magnus would talk of their family, she, he, and his mysterious child. He'd spoken to a doctor at the hospital who'd done some ultrasounds and seemed confident he could manage a safe delivery. Did Ashley want to be in the room? She really didn't want to, but couldn't bring herself to say no. The day finally came for Magnus to give birth. They'd scheduled it, rather than be caught unawares by some kind of an emergency. And the doctor seemed oddly calm, almost as if he'd done this before. And Magnus found himself feeling relaxed too. Ashley was the complete opposite. This was all finally becoming real. Magnus fell in love with his son the moment he heard that strange little cry. It wasn't that it wasn't like a normal baby's cry, because it was. But it also had some otherworldly tone, almost a jarring echo. And a part of Magnus couldn't wait to get his son home to study those vocal cords. Most of him, though, just wanted to wonder. Ashley wasn't so doting. That thing wasn't a baby to her. It didn't even look human. Magnus had no idea his fiancée felt this way. He himself loved little Oberon so much, he couldn't envision anyone else feeling any other way. Now that his son had been born, he blissfully ploughed ahead with their wedding plans, organising everything from the cake to the decorations. She knew she should have said something sooner. She knew it. But she thought that she could do it, that she could push past her feelings about Oberon and marry Magnus anyway. She loved him so goddamn much. Why couldn't she just do that? It was only at the last minute, as she walked down that aisle and looked at that baby in front of that rocket ship, and finally realized that she didn't want that life. A life of aliens and space travel. It was all too weird. Magnus was blindsided. Left at the altar with his newborn alien son, Magnus was heartbroken. He had no idea Ashley had felt that way about Oberon until she'd suddenly screamed that everything had to stop. She couldn't do this. His son was a monster. And then she'd left. Her brother had come by the next week to pack up her things, and although he was on maternity leave, he heard she'd quit the lab. But Magnus was glad she'd gone. If she couldn't love Oberon, then he couldn't love her. His son was his whole weird world. And even though he had no idea what he was doing, he knew he would never give up. Magnus had been holding off on his trip because he'd wanted to surprise Ashley with a honeymoon in space. But now, well, with the money he got from pawning his and Ashley's rings, he was finally able to purchase the most important component in finding Oberon's family, a wormhole generator. Magnus still had a few months of mat leave left, and he wanted to spend that time searching the stars. It was a warm spring day when Magnus finally set off on his journey. He'd spent hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars on his rocket ship, and he had no real idea where to steer once he left Earth's orbit. All he had was a few shots of the nebula he'd been studying in the weeks before his abduction. And that was it. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a shot. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 1 of Magnus Down and the StrangerVille Mystery. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can tune in soon to hear the next chapter. Or like I said, look us up on Facebook for spoilers. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Bye!